What if I told you that making a successful video game is no longer enough to save your job? Not a failure, not a flop, a success. Because in today's gaming industry, even winning can get you fired. 2024, 2025, and now 2026 have become some of the most brutal years in gaming history. Thousands of developers have been laid off, entire studios shut down overnight, and the most confusing part is that many of these companies weren't even struggling. They were profitable. Take Epic Games, for example. They own Fortnite, one of the biggest games on the planet, a cultural phenomenon that practically prints money, and yet they still laid off over 1,000 employees. What they want is dominance. They want infinite growth, endless engagement, and a player base that never leaves. If your game doesn't become a forever platform, if it doesn't generate constant revenue month after month, then it becomes expendable. And nothing proves this more than what happened with Battlefield 6. For years, Call of Duty dominated the FPS genre without question. But finally, Battlefield managed to fight back. And for the first time in history, it actually outsold Call of Duty. It became the #1 game. This should have been a massive win, a comeback story, a moment of celebration for the developers who worked tirelessly to make it happen. But instead, just 18 days after launch, layoffs were announced across DICE, Criterion, and Ripple Effect. Think about that for a second. If becoming the #1 selling game in the world isn't enough to protect your job, then what is? And that brings us to one of the clearest and most recent examples of this trend, the First Berserker, Khazan. Released on March 27, 2025 by Neople under Nexon, it was a hardcore single-player ARPG set in the Dungeon and Fighter universe. It had style, identity, and strong critical reception, earning a very positive rating on Steam. Players praised its cel-shaded visuals, its deep and punishing combat, and the way it stood out in a crowded market of Soulslike games. This wasn't just another clone, it had personality. But behind the scenes, things weren't looking as good as they seemed. At launch, the game peaked at around 33,000 concurrent players, which is a solid number for a niche single-player title. But over time, that number dropped sharply, eventually settling at around 1,000 daily players. And in today's data-driven industry, that kind of drop is seen as a failure to retain engagement. So, Nexon made a decision. The core development team, known as Eon Studio, was dissolved. Not restructured, not downsized, completely dissolved. The developers were reassigned to a maintenance group called the R Team, which is essentially corporate language for putting the game into maintenance mode. Plans for major DLCs and future expansions were quietly put on hold, and just like that, a promising game lost its future. And when the news broke, the community reaction was immediate. Over on Reddit, players expressed a mix of frustration, disappointment, and anger. One user described the situation perfectly, saying, "This is honestly devastating." Khazan was one of the few Soulslikes that actually had its own identity with the cel-shaded look and the DNF lore. To see the team gone before we even get a DLC is a tragedy. That sentiment was echoed by many others who felt like the game deserved more time to grow. Another user pointed out the bigger issue at play, saying, "It feels like if you aren't making $1 billion a month, companies just don't care anymore." A very positive rating should mean something, but it doesn't pay the bills in the eyes of Nexon. And that really highlights the disconnect between players and publishers. For players, quality matters. For corporations, it's all about sustained revenue. Some comments were even more blunt. One user wrote, "Wait, didn't the game just come out? Reassigning the team this early is basically admitting they have no faith in the game's long-tail sales. It's the pump and dump of game development." And while that phrasing might sound harsh, it reflects a growing concern that games are being treated less like long-term creative projects and more like short-term investments. There was also discussion around the game's difficulty. Khazan is a challenging experience, and not everyone was able to stick with it. As one user pointed out, the game was hard, maybe too hard for the casual DNF audience. If the player retention dropped that fast, maybe people just hit a wall and quit. Still, firing the devs isn't the solution. And that raises an important question. Should a game be punished for sticking to its creative vision? Because at its core, that's what this is really about. Not just one game, not just one studio, but an entire industry shifting its priorities. Single-player games, especially ones without live service elements, are becoming harder to justify in a system that values constant engagement above all else. Once players finish the game, they move on. And to publishers, that's a problem. Even if those players loved the experience, left positive reviews, and recommended it to others, they're no longer generating revenue. So where does that leave developers? What message does this send to the people actually making these games? It tells them that success is no longer a shield, that even if you do everything right, create a great game, earn positive reviews, build a dedicated fan base, it still might not be enough. Because if your game doesn't dominate the market, if it doesn't become the next global phenomenon, then it can still be considered disposable. And that's why some are calling this the beginning of a dark age in game development, a time where creativity is risky, where passion projects are sidelined, and where studios are judged not by the quality of their work, but by their ability to generate endless profit. Because when Battlefield 6 can win the sales war and still lose its developers, and Khazan can win the hearts of players but lose its studio, then the message becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't about making great games anymore. It's about chasing numbers. And maybe the most worrying part is what comes next. If this trend continues, we won't just lose studios, we'll lose entire types of games. The kind of games that take risks, that prioritize artistry over monetization, that give us something memorable instead of something endlessly repeatable. So now the question is yours. Is the market simply too crowded for games like Khazan to survive? Or are publishers becoming too focused on short-term gains at the cost of long-term creativity? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more content like this and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.